The morning arrived as though it had been rehearsed for weeks by the heavens themselves. Pale sunlight slipped through the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall, touching silk and lace with a reverence usually reserved for altars. Outside, carriages rolled across the gravel drive, their wheels crunching like whispered prayers. Inside, the house breathed with anticipation. Flowers crowded every surface, their perfume thick enough to taste, and bells from the village church practiced their joy in the distance. This was the day Miss Eleanor Harcourt had built with patient hands and obedient hope. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, calm as a painted saint. Her gown lay draped across a chaise like a promise fulfilled, ivory satin sewn with pearls her mother had once worn. Maids moved around her in soft orbit, tightening ribbons, smoothing sleeves, murmuring praise she accepted with a small, grateful smile. She had planned everything herself, from the placement of candles to the order of hymns, believing that care was a form of love. Today, she would become the Duchess of Wetherby, wife to a man the world admired, and sister to a family newly elevated by his name. Yet beneath the order, something restless stirred. Eleanor sensed it first in the silences. A maid lingered too long by the door. A footman forgot himself and stared. When her aunt arrived, she embraced Eleanor without meeting her eyes. Whispers slipped through corridors like drafts through old stone, cold and searching. Eleanor told herself it was nerves, that a house this full always trembled before ceremony. She straightened her shoulders and asked for her gloves. She went in search of quiet. The eastern wing, seldom used, offered long corridors and the scent of old books. As she walked, the murmur of voices reached her, low and urgent. She paused, uninvited to her own discovery, and saw them through the open door of the conservatory. The Duke stood with his back half turned, his hands resting where they should not have been. Before him was Clara, Eleanor's younger sister, her face tilted upward, flushed with something that was not innocence. His mouth brushed hers with unmistakable familiarity. Time did not shatter. It thickened. Eleanor felt it press against her chest, denying breath, denying sound. The world narrowed to the curve of Clara's cheek, the Duke's gloved hand, the sunlight glaring cruelly upon the glass. No words were spoken, none were needed. The truth announced itself with brutal clarity, and Eleanor understood in that instant that the life she had arranged so carefully was already ruined. She stepped back without thinking, the heel of her slipper striking the marble. The sound was small, yet it echoed. Clara turned first, her eyes widening, then darting away. The Duke followed, his expression tightening into something composed and distant, as though he were already calculating the cost of this moment. Eleanor said nothing. She gathered what remained of herself and walked away, spine straight, hands steady, dignity clinging to her like armor grown suddenly too thin. In the corridor beyond, she paused only once, resting her palm against the wall as though to steady the house itself. Memories rose unbidden. Clara as a child, chasing ribbons through the garden, the Duke kneeling months before, voice solemn as he pledged constancy. Each recollection felt suddenly unreliable, as if truth were a fabric easily altered by desire. Eleanor realized then that betrayal did not always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it came smiling, well-dressed, and utterly certain of its own entitlement. Below stairs, servants traded glances and unfinished sentences. Above, guests adjusted their gloves and speculated softly. Reputation, Eleanor knew, was a creature that fed quickly. By nightfall, her pain would be shaped into rumor, her silence mistaken for consent. She wondered, with a strange calm, whether any version of herself would survive the telling. For the first time, anger flickered, not hot but steady, asking what she might yet refuse. She returned briefly to her chamber and closed the door. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves had leaned inward to listen. Eleanor removed her gloves with care, folding them as she always did, because habit was sometimes the only thing that kept despair from shouting aloud. The Duke lingered nearby, visible through half-open doors, speaking in low tones to her father. His presence felt like pressure on a bruise. Eleanor understood then that silence would be mistaken for permission, and patience for surrender. The house, once warm, now watched her. Conversations faltered as she passed. Eyes slid aside. Someone whispered her name, then stopped. Eleanor felt herself become a spectacle, not yet named but already judged. In the drawing room, her mother sat rigid, fingers clenched around a handkerchief. The flowers seemed too bright, the air too sweet. The bells outside rang again, oblivious. The Duke sought her an hour later, his tone measured, his words chosen with care. He spoke of misunderstanding, of youth, of imprudence swiftly regretted. Eleanor listened as though from a great distance. She noted the absence of apology, the careful preservation of his own dignity. When he reached for her hand, she withdrew it gently, the refusal more devastating than anger. Around them, the house waited. A wedding without a bride was unthinkable, yet so was the bride who now stood before them. By noon, the guests had arrived, feathers and silk filling the hall, curiosity disguised as celebration. Eleanor remained in her chamber, seated before the mirror, staring at a reflection she scarcely recognized. She had entered the morning as a woman about to be claimed. She sat now as something else entirely, unnamed, unprotected. Outside her door, the future gathered its breath, and Eleanor understood that the choice before her would not merely end a wedding, but would define the rest of her life. Somewhere beyond the door, footsteps paused, and Eleanor sensed that destiny itself was listening, waiting to learn whether she would bow, break, or become at last tonight. The wedding did not occur, yet neither did it vanish. It lingered like smoke after a fire, clinging to every conversation in Ashcombe and beyond. By evening, the postponement had been announced with polite vagueness, and by morning, the truth had already grown teeth. Eleanor remained within the house, listening as scandal threaded itself through walls she had once believed secure. Silence became her armor, though it weighed heavily, pressing against her ribs with each passing hour. Calling cards arrived first, stacked upon silver trays like accusations. Some bore sympathy, others curiosity thinly veiled as concern. Eleanor touched none of them. Instead, she watched from her window as carriages came and went, carrying speculation into the countryside. The Duke's absence was noted, then explained, then quietly criticized. Clara did not appear at breakfast. Her chair sat empty, accusing in its stillness. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in that absence, only a deepening sense of unreality. By the second day, society had begun to choose sides. Some whispered that Eleanor had been cold, that a man might naturally seek warmth elsewhere. Others hinted that youth was irresistible, that Clara's beauty had been fate's cruel instrument. Eleanor heard none of this directly, yet it reached her all the same, conveyed through averted glances and strained kindness. Reputation, she learned, did not require evidence. It required only repetition. The Duke sent a letter. It arrived sealed in blue wax, his crest pressed firmly as ever. Eleanor broke it open with steady hands. His words were courteous, regretful in tone, yet distant, as though written for an audience rather than a woman he had once sworn to cherish. He spoke of discretion, of family unity, of the necessity of presenting a united front. Not once did he speak of love. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it beside the hearth, where it remained, unburned and unanswered. Later that afternoon, her mother brought her a small velvet box. Inside lay the engagement ring, returned by the Duke's man with formal bows and unnecessary haste. The diamond caught the light cruelly, brilliant and unrepentant. Eleanor closed the box without comment. The ring had been heavy on her finger. Its absence felt stranger still, as though a part of her identity had been quietly reclaimed by force. It was while she stood alone in the long gallery that Eleanor noticed him. He had arrived without announcement, dressed plainly, his posture reserved. Mr. Thomas Ashford, once a frequent visitor in earlier years, now kept largely to the edges of society. A widower, whispered some, though the truth was rarely spoken aloud. He had known Eleanor before ambition had shaped her future, and he looked at her now without curiosity, without judgment. When their eyes met, he inclined his head, offering respect rather than inquiry. They spoke briefly, of weather and travel, words safe enough to hide behind. Yet beneath the civility, Eleanor sensed a tension, careful and exacting. He did not ask questions. He did not offer consolation. He simply listened, as though silence itself were an act of loyalty. When he departed, he left behind nothing tangible, yet Eleanor felt oddly steadied, as though some invisible weight had shifted. That evening, Clara appeared at last. She stood in the doorway, pale and uncertain, her youth suddenly exposed. She spoke of mistakes, of confusion, of fear. Eleanor listened, her expression composed, though her heart beat hard. Clara's tears fell freely, yet they carried no answers. Forgiveness was requested, not earned. Eleanor told her sister only this, that consequences were not cruelty, and silence was not absolution. Clara fled, leaving behind the echo of her sobs and a fracture that could not be smoothed. News arrived the next day that the Duke had been seen in town, attending a luncheon as though nothing had occurred. Eleanor felt something in her settle then, a quiet resolve born not of rage, but of clarity. She could not control the narrative, but she could refuse to participate in her own erasure. When another letter arrived, this one requesting a private meeting, she declined with measured courtesy. In its place, she sent back the Duke's final token, a pressed white rose from their first summer together. The message was unmistakable. The rose returned to him browned at the edges, its meaning altered forever. That night, as rain struck the windows and thunder rolled distantly, Eleanor sat by the fire, her hands empty at last. Yet the world did not recede. Invitations ceased, then resumed with caution. Some doors closed. Others opened unexpectedly. Mr. Ashford's name appeared again, this time upon a simple card requesting her presence at an upcoming gathering, small and unpublicized. Eleanor studied it long after the servants had withdrawn. She realized then that scandal, like fire, destroyed what was weak and revealed what endured. The life she had prepared was gone, but another waited, uncertain and unshaped. As Eleanor rose to extinguish the lamp, she felt the first stirring of something unfamiliar. Not hope, perhaps, but the courage to stand unguarded before it, whatever judgment or mercy might yet come. The gathering Mr. Ashford proposed was neither a ball nor a dinner, but a quiet evening at his town residence, attended by no more than a dozen souls whose discretion was known and whose curiosity was not easily indulged. Eleanor accepted the invitation with care, aware that any movement she made now would be observed, interpreted, and preserved. When her carriage arrived beneath a sky washed clean by rain, she felt not fear, but a measured resolve, as though she were stepping onto unfamiliar ground by choice rather than force. The house itself was modest by aristocratic measure, its lamps glowing warmly behind tall windows. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and extinguished candles. Conversation was gentle, almost reverent, as though each guest sensed that something fragile occupied the room. Eleanor greeted those she knew and acknowledged the rest with polite restraint. No one mentioned the wedding. No one mentioned the Duke. For the first time in weeks, she felt herself breathe without effort. Mr. Ashford approached her only after the guests had dispersed into smaller conversations. He did not offer his arm, but inclined his head and asked whether she would care to see the conservatory, newly restored after the winter storms. The request was framed as an option, not an insistence. Eleanor agreed, surprised by her own readiness. They passed through a narrow corridor and into a space of glass and greenery, moonlight filtering through the panes and pooling at their feet. For a moment, neither spoke. The plants whispered softly in the night air, leaves stirring with a sound like distant applause. Eleanor felt the weight of unspoken things gather between them, heavy yet oddly comforting. It was Mr. Ashford who broke the silence, his voice low and even. He told her she owed him nothing, not explanation nor courage, and that her presence alone was enough. The words struck her more deeply than any declaration might have. Eleanor found herself speaking then, not with haste, but with precision. She spoke of the morning that had undone her, of the way betrayal had arrived without warning, dressed as familiarity. She admitted, without drama, that she had been raised to endure, not to choose. Each sentence seemed to loosen something within her chest, a knot she had long mistaken for duty. Mr. Ashford listened without interruption, his attention unwavering, as though every word mattered. When she finished, he did not rush to comfort her. Instead, he asked her a question she had not anticipated. He asked what she desired now, not as a daughter or a former fiancé, but as herself. Eleanor was startled by the simplicity of it. Desire had always been a luxury she postponed, a consideration for later seasons. She searched for an answer and found only uncertainty. Yet speaking that uncertainty aloud felt strangely like honesty. Mr. Ashford confessed in turn, though his words were measured. He spoke of his late wife, of love that had been quiet and sustaining, and of the silence that followed her passing. He admitted that he had learned the cost of unspoken truth, and that he recognized in Eleanor a similar restraint. His gaze met hers then, steady and unflinching. He said he admired her not for what she had lost, but for what she had refused to surrender. The world beyond the glass seemed distant, its judgments muted by the night. Eleanor felt something shift within her, a recalibration of worth she had not known she required. She realized that shame had been imposed upon her, not earned, and that dignity was not a fragile thing to be guarded, but a strength to be exercised. The knowledge settled quietly, without triumph, but with permanence. Their conversation drifted then to safer subjects, yet the undercurrent remained. When Eleanor finally took her leave, Mr. Ashford accompanied her to the door. He did not ask when he might see her again. He did not speak of the future. Instead, he told her that should she ever wish to speak without being overheard by expectation, his door would remain open. The offer felt neither presumptuous nor conditional. It felt, simply, available. As her carriage carried her away, Eleanor watched the lamplight recede and considered the evening's effect. Nothing tangible had changed. The scandal still existed. The Duke still occupied his place in society, unscathed. Yet Eleanor felt altered, as though she had been granted permission she did not know she needed. The knowledge that someone had seen her, fully and without agenda, warmed her against the encroaching night. The following days passed with a new texture. Eleanor resumed her routines, though with less rigidity. She declined certain invitations and accepted others. When whispers reached her, they did not strike as deeply. She carried within her the memory of that conversation, its quiet affirmation acting as a steadying force. Still, uncertainty remained, particularly when news arrived that the Duke intended to call upon her, seeking final resolution. Eleanor received the message alone, her fingers tightening briefly around the card before she mastered herself. She thought of the conservatory, of moonlight and leaves, of a question asked without demand. She understood then that the choice before her was no longer about preserving what had been promised, but about claiming what might yet be possible. As evening fell and the house grew still, Eleanor prepared herself to meet the past once more, aware that whatever was said next would determine whether she would continue to be defined by betrayal, or by the courage to step beyond it. The evening of the assembly arrived wrapped in expectation. Chandeliers blazed within the Marrowby Hall, scattering light across marble floors and silk gowns, while music hovered like a held breath. Eleanor entered on her mother's arm, her posture serene, her expression unreadable. Whispers rippled instantly, recognition sharpened by curiosity. She felt them land and pass through her, no longer lodging beneath her skin. The Duke was present, of course, positioned near the hearth as though he belonged there by right. His gaze followed Eleanor with practiced confidence, and when their eyes met, he inclined his head, already preparing the version of events he intended to present. Clara was absent, a fact that drew its own commentary. Eleanor noted these details calmly, as one might observe weather, aware that storms revealed more than they destroyed. Mr. Ashford stood near the periphery, dressed simply, his attention fixed not on the spectacle but on Eleanor herself. When she caught his eye, he did not smile, yet something steady passed between them, an unspoken understanding that steadied her pulse. The room shifted subtly, as though accommodating a truth it had not expected. Conversation resumed around them, forced and glittering. Eleanor was greeted with careful courtesy, sympathy measured to avoid offense. She answered graciously, refusing both pity and bitterness. Each exchange strengthened her resolve. She was no longer here to endure judgment. She was here to speak. The Duke approached at last, his presence commanding space. He requested her attention with a tone designed to sound generous. When Eleanor agreed, the room leaned closer, though no one openly stared. The music softened, as if complicit. He spoke of reconciliation, of shared history, of forgiveness offered as though it were his to grant. He suggested, delicately, that appearances could yet be managed. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he finished, she replied quietly, yet her words carried. She thanked him for his concern and corrected his narrative with precision. She spoke of truth, of choice, and of respect withheld too long. She named his betrayal without raising her voice. The Duke's expression tightened, and used to refusal delivered without hysteria. Murmurs stirred. The balance of the room shifted palpably. The Duke attempted to reclaim control, reminding her of what she stood to lose. Eleanor met his gaze steadily and answered that she had already lost what was false. Silence followed, thick and undeniable. It was then that Mr. Ashford stepped forward. He did not interrupt, nor did he accuse. He addressed the room itself, speaking with measured calm. He declared that Eleanor Harcourt stood before them unblemished by scandal, that integrity was not conferred by title, and that dignity required witnesses willing to defend it. His voice neither rose nor faltered. The effect was immediate. What had been spectacle became reckoning. Eleanor felt emotion rise, not overwhelming, but clarifying. She understood that courage multiplied when shared. Turning once more to the Duke, she concluded the matter herself, stating plainly that the engagement was ended irrevocably, and that her future would no longer be negotiated. Applause did not follow. Instead, something rarer occurred. People breathed. The truth settled. The Duke withdrew, his authority diminished by exposure. Eleanor remained, unbowed. Mr. Ashford offered his arm, not as rescue, but as companionship freely chosen. As they left the hall together, Eleanor felt the night air cool her flushed skin. The weight she had carried for months lifted, replaced by uncertainty that felt alive rather than suffocating. She did not know what awaited her beyond this moment, only that she had claimed herself aloud. Yet the victory was not without cost. Eleanor sensed eyes upon her back as they moved through the corridors, some admiring, some resentful. She understood that society rarely forgave women who refused their assigned endings. Still, her step did not falter. She recalled Mr. Ashford's earlier question, the one that had unsettled her, and recognized that she had answered it at last, not in private, but before witnesses who could no longer pretend ignorance. The carriage waited beyond the steps, its lanterns glowing like watchful eyes. As Eleanor paused, she felt the enormity of what had occurred settle more fully. Public truth, once spoken, could not be withdrawn. It reshaped alliances, invited retaliation, and demanded endurance. She wondered briefly whether she possessed enough strength for what might follow, then dismissed the doubt. Strength, she had learned, revealed itself only after necessity called it forth. Mr. Ashford assisted her into the carriage, his touch light, respectful, lingering only long enough to communicate support. Their eyes met once more, and in that look Eleanor sensed questions neither of them yet dared to voice. Affection, perhaps, or something sterner, forged in shared principle rather than fantasy. The carriage door closed, sealing the moment, yet its meaning traveled with her, echoing louder than the fading music behind them. Alone now, Eleanor allowed herself a single unguarded breath. The future remained uncertain, crowded with consequences she could not yet measure, but it was hers to confront. She no longer felt compelled to explain herself to echoes of tradition. Whatever storms followed would find her standing, not waiting to be rescued, but prepared to choose, again and again, who she would become. Even so, a final reckoning loomed. The Duke's silence following his retreat promised nothing benign, and Eleanor understood that power, once challenged, rarely withdrew with grace. As the carriage turned onto the darkened road, she felt the pull of approaching confrontation, aware that this night had ended one battle, not the war. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but anticipation, for she sensed that truth spoken publicly now demanded private courage soon from both of them alike before dawn arrived once more together. Behind them, the doors closed on an old story. Ahead lay a path unmarked, illuminated only by intention. Eleanor glanced at Mr. Ashford, sensing that this declaration had bound her not to him, but to possibility itself, and that whatever followed would demand a different, braver kind of love. Morning arrived without spectacle, pale and deliberate, as though the world itself required time to adjust to what had been spoken aloud the night before. Eleanor woke before the house, the silence unfamiliar yet welcome. For the first time since the failed wedding, she did not reach instinctively for composure. Instead, she lay still, listening to her own breathing, testing the quiet for fear. It did not arrive. News followed, as it always did. The Duke's withdrawal from several engagements was noted with polite astonishment. His influence did not vanish, but it wavered, its certainty bruised by exposure. Clara departed Ashcombe quietly, escorted to distant relatives, her absence discussed with a restraint that signaled judgment more severe than gossip. Eleanor felt no triumph in this. Consequences, once set in motion, no longer belonged to her. Mr. Ashford called 2 days later. He did not bring flowers or sentiment, only conversation and a steady presence. They walked the gardens together, the early roses heavy with dew. He spoke of practical matters, of travel delayed and responsibilities resumed, anchoring her in the ordinary. Eleanor realized how desperately she needed this grounding, this reminder that life continued beyond scandal's narrow lens. It was Eleanor who spoke next, her voice calm, resolute. She thanked him for the assembly, not as a rescue, but as an act of witness. She told him that his words had altered the course of her life. Mr. Ashford listened, then replied that he had spoken only what he believed, and that belief had cost him nothing compared to her courage. The simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than vows. As days passed, Eleanor found herself changed in small, unmistakable ways. She chose her correspondence carefully, declined invitations without apology, and accepted others that once would have seemed improper. Her name remained a topic, but it no longer defined her. She had learned the difference between being discussed and being diminished. The Duke sought her once more, requesting a final audience. Eleanor agreed, not from obligation, but from a desire to end what lingered unresolved. They met in the same conservatory where truth had first revealed itself. He spoke of regret, sharpened now by consequence. Eleanor answered him with clarity, neither cruel nor conciliatory. She told him she wished him well, but apart from her life. When she turned away, she felt no pull to look back. That evening, Eleanor found Mr. Ashford waiting at the edge of the estate, his carriage prepared. He had not announced himself, respecting her autonomy even now. She joined him without ceremony. As they traveled, conversation unfolded slowly, unforced. The road ahead was uncertain, yet Eleanor sensed something profound in the absence of urgency between them. At a quiet inn along the river, they paused to dine. Candlelight softened the room, and outside, water moved steadily, indifferent to human affairs. It was there, over a simple meal, that Eleanor spoke of fear, not of scandal, but of hope. She admitted that she had learned to endure loss, but not yet how to trust happiness. Mr. Ashford considered this, then told her that happiness was not a destination, but a discipline, practiced daily through choice. The words settled deeply. Eleanor felt something open, cautiously, like a window unlatched after years of careful closure. She realized that love, when stripped of illusion, did not demand surrender. It invited partnership. When Mr. Ashford reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture carried no urgency, only promise. They did not speak of marriage. They spoke of mornings, of shared labor, of quiet evenings unmarked by performance. Eleanor understood then that the greatest romance was not found in grand declarations, but in the freedom to remain oneself without fear of abandonment. Weeks later, Eleanor returned to Ashcombe, not as a retreat, but as a farewell. She walked the halls where her former life had echoed, now observing them with detachment. In her chamber, she found the gloves she had folded that day, preserved like relics. She left them behind, an offering to a past self she no longer needed to inhabit. Before departing, she stood once more in the conservatory. Sunlight filtered through the glass, gentler now. Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed deeply, acknowledging the pain that had shaped her and the strength it had revealed. She did not regret what she had lost. It had led her here. When she joined Mr. Ashford beyond the gates, she did so without hesitation. The carriage moved forward, carrying them toward a life undefined by expectation. Eleanor felt the quiet thrill of authorship, of choosing a future not prescribed by lineage or fear. As the road unfolded, Eleanor leaned back, watching the countryside emerge, expansive and alive. She thought of the girl who had planned a perfect wedding and smiled softly, not in mockery, but in gratitude. That girl had believed in love as it was promised. This woman believed in love as it was lived. The past would remember her as a scandal narrowly survived. The future, she knew, would remember her differently. And as the carriage disappeared into the widening light, Eleanor Harcourt stepped fully into the knowledge that dignity reclaimed was the truest triumph of all, and that from its steady ground, every worthy love must begin.